The metal groaned as the bus rested sideways in the ravine, its wheels half buried in the damp earth, while steam hissed from the shattered radiator. The surrounding forest loomed like a wall of shadows, ancient trees leaning over them with branches. Like skeletal arms reaching down, the passengers stumbled out one by one, disoriented, bruised, some bleeding, as the reality of what just happened began to settle in. The driver lay slumped over the wheel, unconscious, with blood trickling from his temple, and no one knew how bad it really was. Curtis was the first to move with purpose, his instincts kicking in fast. He had served 2 tours overseas and knew how panic could kill quicker than injury. He pulled the driver from the seat and checked, his pulse faint but steady, then scanned the group. 12 people, ranging from a teenage girl in shock to an elderly man clutching his chest and breathing heavily. He called for everyone to sit down and stay calm, but his voice was already being drowned out by rising fear and confusion. They had no cell service that was confirmed quickly, and the nearest road was several miles behind them, with no guarantee that anyone had seen the crash. The trees were thick, the air heavy and filled with the scent of moss pine and engine fluid. Several passengers began arguing about what to do. One woman wanted to climb back up the ravine, but she was wearing sandals and nearly slipped, trying to scale the loose dirt another man insisted they make. A fire to signal for help, but Curtis warned them that fire could bring attention, not all of it good. As night approached, the temperature dropped fast, and the forest began to change its sound. The birds that had chirped all afternoon fell silent, replaced by the occasional rustle in the underbrush. The hoot of an owl and something else, something too faint to identify but loud enough to make them stop talking and listen. They all heard it, a single crack like a twig snapping not far from the edge of the clearing, and when Curtis turned to look, there was nothing, just darkness and more trees. They huddled close that night, using jackets and ripped seat cushions for warmth. Curtis took first watch, pacing the edge of the wreckage with eyes scanning the trees. He thought about his daughter back home, about how she had begged him not to take this trip, about the look in her eyes when she sensed something was wrong, and now standing there in the wilderness with no contact and no light, except the dying beam of a flickering headlamp. He began to wonder if this was the kind of warning he should have listened to. Sometime after midnight, he heard it again. Not a twig this time, but something more deliberate. Footsteps too heavy to be an animal and too steady to be the wind. He froze, crouched low and peered into the trees, then saw it a glint of something metallic reflecting the moonlight, high up, maybe on a ridge or a branch. It was gone in a blink, and when he blinked again, he wasn't sure if he had seen anything at all, but his gut twisted the way it used to before an ambush, and he quietly woke the others, whispering for silence. They waited together in complete stillness, listening as the forest seemed to hold its breath. But no more sounds came. The night stretched on, and with it came fear. Not just of the unknown, but of each other. Everyone was tired, cold, and suspicious. Accusing glances were exchanged, whispered theories about what might be out there. One man claimed he saw eyes watching from the trees. Another said they should all split up and find help before it was too late. Curtis shut that down fast, knowing that separation was the surest way to die out here, if not from exposure, then from something worse. At dawn, the forest returned to life as if the night had never happened. Birds sang and sun rays broke through the canopy, casting golden lines across the wreckage. But the tension had not lifted. If anything, it deepened, because now they could see footprints near the edge of the clearing. Large boot prints leading in from the trees and stopping only a few feet from where they had slept. No one had boots like that, not even Curtis, and when he pointed this out, the group went silent. All of them staring at the ground and then slowly looking back at the trees. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a hallucination. Someone had been there watching them while they slept, and for what purpose no one could say, but that single fact changed everything. From that moment on, they were not just survivors waiting to be rescued, they were targets in a game they didn't understand, and one they had no way of escaping. The food was limited. The water from the stream was questionable, and worst of all, they had no weapons, no protection, just scraps of metal from the bus and whatever courage they could scrape together. Curtis began building a perimeter using branches, rocks, and anything he could find, trying to create a barrier of sound. Something that would alert them if anyone or anything entered their space. He showed the others how to stay low, how to move without making noise, how to listen for patterns that did not belong in nature, but he also knew that if whoever was out there had a rifle, or worse, a scope, they would be seen long before they ever saw the threat later that afternoon, as they were boiling water over a small fire hidden behind a mound of earth. They heard it again, the rustling, but this time, closer, more deliberate. Curtis grabbed a branch and crept toward the sound heart, pounding with every step. What he saw made his stomach twist, a torn piece of fabric hanging from a tree with words scrawled in red. Something smeared and ugly that looked like paint but smelled like something else. And when he turned to call for help, he realized the fabric wasn't there. Before it had been placed deliberately while they weren't looking. That night, no one slept. They sat with backs pressed together, eyes wide, ears straining. At every sound, the forest no longer felt alive, it felt haunted, and when a single shot cracked through the night, splitting the silence like lightning and striking just inches from where Curtis had been standing, the truth settled in. This wasn't just a crash. It wasn't just survival. Someone was hunting them, and they had no idea why or how long they had left before the next shot found its mark. The shot echoed through the trees, and for a moment, no one moved, frozen in disbelief as bark splintered off a tree trunk inches from Curtis' shoulder. He dropped to the ground, immediately yelling for everyone to get down, crawling fast toward the bus wreckage, dragging one of the injured tourists behind him as another round cracked through. The clearing this time, hitting metal and sending sparks into the dirt beside the fire. Whoever was out there had a high vantage point and a clear view, and they were not missing on purpose. Panic exploded like wildfire. Some screamed, others ran for. Cover diving behind the broken axles and twisted seats of the overturned vehicle, one man bolted toward the tree line, but barely made it 3 steps before another shot rang out, and he dropped with a sharp cry, clutching his leg. Curtis shouted at him to stay down. The sniper wasn't trying to kill yet, but was clearly capable and clearly in control of the situation, and that terrified Curtis more than the bullets, because it meant this was deliberate, this was staged, this was a hunt. As the group huddled in silence under the bus frame, the teenager Emily began sobbing into her knees, while her older brother tried to comfort her, both of them shaking with fear. Beside them was Mrs. Lang, the elderly woman who had barely spoken since the crash. Her face pale, and her breathing shallow. She had a heart condition, and every shock brought her closer to collapse. Curtis scanned the ridge line through a shard of shattered mirror, using it to reflect sunlight upward to try to catch movement in the trees. But nothing revealed itself. No flash of scope, no outline, no sign of the shooter. Time dragged as the forest seemed to tighten around them, shadows lengthened across the ravine, and the light shifted in odd patterns. The silence grew unbearable, broken only by the occasional moan from the man with the wounded leg, or the soft tremor of whispered prayers. Someone had started counting the shots, trying to determine how many rounds were fired and how many might be left. But Curtis knew that was a waste of time. This sniper, whoever they were, wasn't careless, wasn't random, and most definitely wasn't alone. When darkness fell, Curtis ordered everyone to stay low and move only when necessary. They had to relocate, find better cover. The bus was too exposed, the clearing too open, and if the sniper had night vision, they were sitting ducks. They crawled one by one into the brush, Curtis leading the way, until they reached a rock formation partially hidden by ferns and roots, where they could hole up temporarily. There was no fire, no light, only the faint glow of the stars through the canopy and the sound of insects that never stopped chirping, even when everything else seemed to hold its breath. That was when they heard the whistle, soft at first, barely audible, a single rising note like someone calling a dog. It happened again, 10 minutes later, this time closer. Curtis signaled for silence, holding up a hand as he crouched behind a log, straining to hear it again. It came once more, and then again further off, like someone was moving through the forest whistling as they walked, and every note was the same length, the same rhythm, deliberate, unnatural, and deeply wrong. The wounded man started to panic, whispering that they were being herded like cattle, and Curtis knew he might be right. The shots, the noise, the whistle, it all felt like strategy, as if they were being pushed toward a specific place, a location. Someone wanted them to reach for reasons no one could understand, and that made Curtis' blood run cold, because in combat, the worst enemy was always the one who thought ahead, the one who enjoyed control, the one who planned the end before the beginning even started. Sometime around midnight, something changed. The whistle stopped, and for the first time in hours, the forest went completely silent. Not a single leaf rustled, not a single bird or bug made a sound, and Curtis felt the dread hit him harder than any bullet could, because silence like that meant something was watching, something waiting. He signaled the group to stay low and scanned the trees again, and that was when he saw it. Not a person, not a weapon, but a red dot on a tree trunk 20 feet. Away, a laser sight moving slowly, then locking in on the rock they were hiding behind. Without thinking, Curtis grabbed Emily and threw her down the slope as the first shot split. The air wood exploded behind them, and the group scattered, diving into the underbrush as more shots followed, each one precise, each one measured. Someone screamed, someone else shouted for help. But Curtis ignored it all as he crawled toward the ridge, trying to flank the shooter. His only hope being that the sniper wouldn't expect aggression, wouldn't expect someone to move toward danger instead of away from it. As he moved, the world narrowed to breath and heartbeat, the smell of earth and sweat, the sting of leaves and dirt in his eyes. And then suddenly, a whisper. Too close to be real? A voice saying his name, not loudly but softly, as if mocking him. It wasn't anyone from the group. It was deeper, colder, and Curtis froze, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he turned slowly instead, scanning the trees, and saw no one, only the faint shimmer of heat on the air and the unmistakable feeling of being seen. He reached the top of the ridge without drawing fire, but his nerves were fraying. Each step felt like a risk, and each branch underfoot felt like a trap. Then he found it, a flattened patch of grass with empty shell casings still warm to the touch, and a scope left behind, half buried in the dirt, as if whoever had been there had left in a hurry. Curtis picked it up, inspected it, and saw that the lens had been shattered not by accident but by force, and beside it in the dirt was a symbol carved deep into the soil, a spiral intersected by a single slash like a target or a warning. Curtis backed away slowly, heart hammering as he realized the truth. The sniper had been here, yes, but they were gone now. Moved on, or worse, maybe still watching from somewhere else. And they had left behind the scope for a reason. Maybe as a message, maybe as bait. Maybe because this was never about picking them off, but about terrifying them, breaking them, pushing them until they snapped and made mistakes, because that was the real weapon. Fear back at the rocks, the others were shaken. 2 were injured now, and Mrs. Lang had collapsed. Her pulse faint. Curtis knew they couldn't stay in one place any longer. They had to move again to higher ground, where they could at least see their surroundings, even if it made them more visible. But as he led the group forward, carefully, quietly, he caught sight of something on a nearby tree. A photo stapled to the bark. Not just any photo, but one of the tour group taken at the start of the trip. All of them smiling unaware, and beneath the image in jagged letters burned into the wood was a single word chosen: Curtis. stared at the word, then at the photo, then back at the forest, as his mind raced trying to understand what this meant. Who had taken that picture? How had they gotten it up there, and why would they call them chosen? What purpose did that serve? What game were they now a part of? Because if someone had planned this, if someone had known where they would be, if someone had printed that photo before the crash, then everything up to this moment had been orchestrated and there was no such thing as coincidence anymore. Just then a scream tore through the trees. A man from the group was gone, vanished while they had been moving. No one had seen him leave. No one had heard a struggle. His bag was still lying in the dirt, and a bloody handprint was smeared across it, fresh and still glistening as the group circled around it. Curtis felt something shift in the air, a change in pressure, and the return of that eerie sound, the soft, slow whistle rising from somewhere too close and way too calm to be anything but a threat. They lay scattered among knotted roots and damp leaves, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and fear. Curtis paused motionless, listening to the forest breathe the canopy above thick with shadows, the air heavy with cold, and the scent of moss and distant rain droplets falling unseen into darkness. He inched forward each movement, careful, silent, until a low whisper echoed so soft, yet so clear, it seemed inside his head it spoke his name, and he froze. The voice wasn't one of theirs. It was deeper, colder, filled with mockery and promise of pain. He held his breath, his pulse ringing loud in his ears, and he realized the forest itself felt alive and malicious, feeding off their terror. Somewhere behind him, Emily whimpered, clutching her brother, and Mrs. Lang moaned, holding her chest. Curtis looked back, but saw only darkness. Then he noticed movement just beyond the faint glow of moonlight. A shadow flickered between trees, as if impatient pacing, waiting for them to move a trap, not just in physical terms, but psychological one, too. Curtis counted breaths, trying to steady himself, tracking the beat of his own fear. Each inhale drawing more tension, each exhale offering no relief. He signaled the group forward. They crawled inch by inch toward higher ground, toward rock outcropping that might offer vantage, might offer a chance, but every step was a gamble. The sniper could be above, below, beside, always unseen, but watching, learning their rhythm, their fear, their weakness. Curtis felt the weight of each life in his care as he pushed them on each one, a fragile thread he could not break. As they crept through bent grasses toward the ridge, the whisper returned, same tone, same cadence, like someone surveying a trap ready to spring. Curtis stopped and turned back, scanning the darkness, but again saw nothing, just silence thick like water. Then, in the corner of his vision, a flash of metal glinting from a branch, too deliberate, too placed to be, random, and behind it, the whistle began again. That soft, rising note drawn out, haunting, mocking. Curtis dropped down and pressed his hand to the ground, his palm cold and sticky. He slid around behind a tree whose bark was shredded and splintered. As if someone had sharpened fingernails into it, there were grooves clawed into the wood, a struggle recorded there, and beneath them, footprints smeared in dirt, too vague to track, but close enough to fill his mind with dread. He thought of Mrs. Lang's failing heart, of how little time they had, how fragile human bodies became in fear, in cold, in darkness. He scrambled forward, crawling toward the ridge. After Scout's been a soldier, he knew terrain better than most. He looked for roots and stones to propel upward, not fall backward, but the forest resisted each movement. Roots grabbed his hands, branches struck his face, his clothing torn by rough bark and thorns, until he reached a rise that looked over the clearing below, and there saw the bus. Wreckage small and vulnerable, a prisoner cage in a world that had no mercy. He held up a finger signaling, "Stay quiet," then shouted softly to the group to freeze. There were shapes moving below, long limbs swaying. They could be trees, but they weren't. Trees, they moved with intent, with purpose, waiting for something, waiting for them to show fear. Curtis wondered if the sniper was guiding them somehow, orchestrating their panic, tuning their terror like an instrument. He thought of the carved photo. The word chosen. The scope left like bait, all pieces pointing to design, not chance. The shapes moved closer, revealing lean silhouettes draped in shadows, and in a second a flare shot up from the ravine, illuminating them. Pale faces distorted by fear. Or something darker, they froze like statues. Then the light went out and the silhouettes vanished, the cliff echoing with gunfire as bullets ricocheted off stone, sending dust and echoes skyward. Curtis ducked, flinched at each crack of lead, each snap of splintering wood beneath him. The air filled with sound of chaos, without form, without mercy. He dove backward into the brush, pulling the others with him. They rolled into the blackness of undergrowth, each breath ragged, each heart pounding. Louder than the shots overhead, the forest alive with noise, branches snapping under pressure, footsteps, chasing retreat, descending toward the ridge they had reached for safety, only to invite destruction upon themselves. Curtis forced his body forward. Through the leaves, his mind flashing with every possible outcome, every failed plan he had made, every life depending on him. And then he saw her, the missing man, the one gone earlier, his body half hidden, half twisted, grotesque against a boulder, his chest crimson and ragged, his eyes glassy and empty. Curtis spat a curse into the darkness, the reality breaking something cold and final inside him. The forest closed in and the whistle returned. Not distant now, but immediate, circling around. Them taunting as leaves shook overhead and the forest seemed to press closer, capturing their scent, their fear, their ragged breath. Curtis grabbed Emily and her brother and pulled them toward a cave mouth, just wide enough for bodies enough to hide. Not enough to give strength. He pressed them in and followed, slipping inside into Black Hollow, where the ground sloped downward and the air stank of damp stone and earth. In that pitch-black whisper returned closer than breathing, sounding just. Outside the opening, and Curtis froze, shielding the others with his body, shadows dancing at the edge of vision, the sense of being watched intensified to suffocation. They stayed silent, the only sound the child beside him whimpering softly and his own heart hammering unsteady. The walls felt alive, pressed in as if the forest had bones and flesh, and was breathing them deeper inside until they had no choice, no escape. Curtis inched forward deeper into the cave, each step echoing in darkness, every sense screaming, run, fight, hide, do whatever. But not stay here with predator at mouth. The cave narrowed his breath, caught in his chest as he felt movement behind a rock. Shard of rock sliding like someone testing the space behind it, and then a low scrape like metal on stone, the whistle humming, calmer, softer like lullaby before death. And Curtis braced himself, preparing to protect the others at cost of his own. Life then, a click sound like a switch flipping metal. Something heavy moved and the opening shifted, letting in dim light and revealing the silhouette of a man. There, not the sniper, not a monster, but a man. Tall, lean, wearing shape of authority, maybe. A hunter, maybe, protector. Curtis saw an arm raised, holding something long and unidentifiable, and the whisper came again, his voice the deepest they had ever heard. And he said, "Your move." Curtis stared into the eyes of the man standing in the cave. Mouth, tall, silent face cast in shadow. The rifle in his arms held loosely like it had already done what it needed to do. The light from outside barely touched him, but enough to show boots caked with mud and a jacket stained with something dark. And long dried the others behind Curtis froze, as the stranger stepped forward slowly, his boots silent on the stone. His presence enormous, as if the space around him bent inward, drawn by whatever purpose he carried with him into that cave. He said, Nothing for a long moment, just watched the group and then lowered his weapon not to drop it, but to rest it casually against his shoulder. And that gesture unsettled Curtis more than anything, because it wasn't the posture of someone offering help. It was someone measuring the last few minutes of a game already won and waiting to see how the pieces reacted. Curtis stepped between the man and the other's hands, raised slowly, voice low and controlled, asking who he was, what he wanted, why. He had brought them here, but the man only smiled slightly, a twitch of the mouth without warmth, without life, and pointed deeper into the cave. Curtis turned just enough to glance back and saw what the man was showing, a narrow tunnel descending steep, into the rocks slick with moisture and barely wide enough for one person at a time. It looked natural, but something about it felt too symmetrical, too carved, and Curtis knew in his gut that they were meant to go down there. It wasn't just shelter, it was direction. It was a next step, a continuation of whatever nightmare had begun days before on the roadside, in the moment before the crash, before the shots, before the whispers. The stranger said 3 words, "Go or die," and Curtis believed him. Not just because of the weapon or the way he stood, but because of something older, deeper in his eyes, a coldness not born of cruelty, but of certainty, as if this path had been chosen long before any of them boarded that bus, and now nothing could be altered, no matter how hard they tried. Curtis hesitated, then nodded, pulling Emily and her brother forward, telling the others to follow, each one sliding into the tunnel. Slowly, hesitantly, each one glancing back at the man who never moved. Never blinked, only watched, as if checking off names from a list written long ago. The tunnel was colder than the cave above the air, thick with the scent of minerals and damp earth. Each step echoed in a way that made them feel smaller with every movement, like they were shrinking into the dark. The walls grew tighter, and Curtis had to crouch, pushing forward into the unknown heart, pounding breath ragged, trying to keep the group together, trying to listen for anything ahead or behind that didn't belong. The deeper they went, the more the tunnel seemed to hum, a low vibration in the stone, like something mechanical or alive hidden just beneath the surface. They came to a chamber not wide, not tall, but enough to stand in and wait. The walls were lined with smooth stone-carved symbols etched deep and old, not language, not numbers, something more primal. Spirals within spirals, lines intersecting at impossible angles. Curtis ran his hand over one, and it felt warm to the touch, pulsing faintly, like veins under skin. The others whispered behind him, voices barely holding together, some crying, some praying. Curtis knelt down and looked closer at the floor, and saw something that made his stomach drop, a perfect circle of ash and bone shaped, like a nest or a ritual, and in its center a single bullet casing, polished and clean. Before he could react, a sound filled the chamber, low and rising, like metal bending or breathing, like breath drawn deep into lungs. The walls seemed to contract, slightly, then expand again, like the entire cave was exhaling. The symbols on the walls shimmered faintly, and Curtis felt the ground tremble, not with impact, but with movement, like something deeper was shifting, adjusting, preparing. And then the whisper returned, not one voice now, but many, layered and echoing like wind over graves, saying the same word over and over, chosen. A passage opened behind them, not with a door, not with any machine, but with stones sliding aside in a smooth circular motion, revealing a narrow stair descending into red light, and the smell that came from below was coppery metallic, filled with heat and rot, like something ancient and buried now exposed. Curtis didn't speak, didn't move, only stared down the stairs. As the others clustered behind him, terrified and silent, Emily tugged his sleeve, eyes wide, asking what now, and he had no answer, because nothing in his life had prepared him for this. Nothing in war or loss or pain matched what waited in that red light. Then something moved below a shadow, taller than a man, shifting in that light like smoke and form. At once the sound of chains dragging over stone followed, and a rhythmic thud like footsteps, but slower, heavier, older. Curtis grabbed a broken pipe from the ground, held it like a weapon, even though he knew it meant nothing down here where rules no longer applied, where the world was shaped by whatever nightmare had built this place. He turned to the others and told them to run. Told them to go back through the tunnel, but the entrance was gone, sealed behind them smooth wall, where passage had been no seams, no cracks, only cold stone and symbols burning faintly like coals. They were trapped, and something was coming, something old and patient and prepared to take them one by one. Curtis stepped forward, placing himself between the group and the stair, the pipe in his hand, useless but steady, and he called out to the shadow below, asking what it wanted, who it was, why it had chosen them. And the reply came not in words, but in images, flooding his mind, fire and hunger, and the crash. Not an accident, but a start. The photos, the sniper, the voice in the woods, all part of something bigger, something ancient, something that had waited for a group like this to arrive, for this exact moment to unfold. The figure below stepped forward into full view, and what Curtis saw broke him, not because it was monstrous, but because it was human, or had once been human, wearing a face he recognized. From the bus, from before the crash, the driver, the man who had been unconscious in the seat, who had bled and been silent, now walking strong and whole and smiling with eyes that were not his own, filled with light that pulsed and reached and devoured. The man raised his arm, and in it was a long object, not a weapon, but a rod or staff etched with the same spiral symbol, and from its tip came a sound like laughter, like 100 mouths laughing inside one head. Curtis turned to the group, told them to back away, to stay behind him, but the ground beneath them cracked. The chamber shook, and from the walls emerged more figures, not people, but things shaped like people, hollow-eyed and slow-moving, with limbs too long and hands too many. Curtis swung the pipe at the nearest one, and it passed through air like smoke, and the thing laughed with a voice like broken glass. The group screamed and scattered, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere left to hide. The cave was alive and closing its hands. Around them, Curtis looked at Emily, her face pale, her brother holding her close, and he knew what would happen next. He knew that they would be taken or changed or erased from memory itself, and the last thing he saw before the red light swallowed them was the figure at the bottom of the stair, lifting the staff and whispering one final word, not in threat, but in welcome. And that word echoed louder than all the others before it home.